Welcome to the National Workshop of the VIRTEU Research Project focusing on the Netherlands. I'm Dr. Costantino Grasso. I'm an associate professor in business and law at Manchester Law School, and I serve as the principal investigator of this research project. I would like to thank all participants for getting involved in this event, which is particularly important in the context of our research project. VIRTEU is a multidisciplinary international research project financed by the European Commission through the European Anti-Fraud Office. It aims at exploring the interconnections between tax crimes and corruption with the intent to reveal in-depth relations between fraudulent and corrupt practices in the area of taxation. In order to achieve the research objectives, at VIRTEU we are conducting a series of activities such as background research, which was carried out to collect and analyze all essential information that constituted the project's foundation, interaction with high-level experts, including both our national leading experts and research associates, as well as a series of roundtables, seminars, and other academic events aimed at discussing the most burning issues that have emerged as a result of our research activities. Finally, we are organizing a series of national workshops, just like the one we are about to begin today, which are aimed at obtaining essential feedback on the research outcomes. Today's workshop serves a great purpose to the research project framework. Through a series of questions, the members of the national expert panel will be called upon to provide critical evaluations based on their professional experience about the relation between tax crime and corruption. The discussion will aim at shedding light on systemic weaknesses within the context of contrasting such criminal phenomena from a legal and practical perspective. Given the lack of time and how important it is to cover all research objectives and also to avoid the running over time, I would like to ask that everyone make an effort to limit their answer time to 1 or 2 minutes tops. For that very reason, I would like to ask that you provide precise and concise answers in order to offer the necessary critical analysis to tackle and identify the specific issues addressed in the questions. During the actual debate, it won't be necessary for all experts to contribute to every question. Please feel free to intervene when you believe it's important to share your knowledge and professional experience. The discussion will be divided in two parts, lasting roughly 1 hour each. The first part, the first 6 questions, will be moderated by the project's co-investigator, Dr. Lorenzo Pasculli, who serves as Associate Head for Research at Coventry Law School. Then, after a short break, I will take on the second part of the discussion from questions number 7 to question number 12, and we will go on with that. Now, I would like to introduce our panel of national experts in alphabetical order and thank them again most sincerely for joining our discussion. So we will have Pascal Bonnet, project manager in the area of anti-money laundering at the Dutch Fiscal Information and Investigation Service Department. Martin Lambrechts, a public prosecutor at the Netherlands Public Prosecution Department. Josine Paulussen, public prosecutor at the Netherlands Public Prosecution Department and national expert at the European Anti-Fraud Office. In order to make the experience even more valuable, we invited another panel, which is the panel of the experts associated with the research project that will interact with the national experts for the mere purpose of stimulating and supplementing the discussion. I shall go ahead and introduce the panel of experts associated with the project, again in alphabetical order. Professor Joseph McCurry, full professor in commercial and business law at Tilburg University and VIRTEU National leading expert for the Netherlands. Branislav Ock, senior lecturer in economic
I think Costa is frozen.
Lecturing in criminal law at the University of Roehampton. Project experts, unlike members when needed, this way we will be able to enrich the discussion whilst abiding by the time restriction we've set ourselves. Basically, after the analysis of each research objective, the moderator will ask project experts if they wish to intervene in order to stimulate further discussion or clarify key points. I would like also to thank Stephen Holden, who serves as research assistant within the project VIRTEU and is currently PhD candidate at the Manchester Metropolitan University. Finally, I would like to give a special and most sincere thank you to the European Anti-Fraud Office, and in particular to Josine Paulussen and Massimiliano Vincenti for the crucial support in organizing this event they have provided us with. A final note on GDPR, I would like to thank all of you who already provided us with the signed filming and photography consent form. If you can please send the form to us at your earliest convenience, this will be really appreciated. Anyway, your participation in today's sessions entails your implicit consent to the publication of recordings, as well as extracts of it on websites, online platforms, and social networks used by the research project or by third parties with whom we have established a partnership. I will now give the floor to Dr. Pasculi to begin the debate. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Costa. So let's crack on with the first round of questions because the time is very limited, as you know. So the first set of questions focuses on the phenomenon of tax crimes in your jurisdiction. So the idea is to have a look at the practices of tax fraud, how it happens, how it's commonly perpetrated, and so on and so forth. So the general question is to explore this phenomenon in your jurisdiction with particular focus on transnational criminal schemes and VAT frauds. So the first question I would like to ask you in this set is, what behaviors and practices does the law in your jurisdiction criminalize as tax offenses? So what are the main behaviors that are criminalized as tax offenses?
And then no one spoke. Maybe I will give it a try to start. Because I think it's a bit of a maybe difficult question, because I can only speak, first of all, out of my experience. I'm not all knowing in this area, and I don't claim to be. And also, I really focus on the criminal part. I have some administrative experience now in OLAF, but as a prosecutor, I of course did only criminal investigations. This is the longest answer you will get from me. And I think, like, we have these Article 68, 69, which is when you intentionally commit fraud with your tax returns. So this is the ones we dealt with or deal with, because it's still ongoing, unfortunately. But apart from that, you also have things like intentionally misleading or falsifying documents that are not specific for tax crimes, but we see them quite often because people tend to falsify documents, well, to commit tax fraud, for example. And then if you look at, apart from the law, like, what do you see as big how do you see crimes that we investigate is, for example, for transnational, that's very often VAT carousel or MTIC frauds.
Fantastic. So is there an offense for carousel fraud? Is there a specific offense? No. So it's one of the ways in which tax fraud is committed, but it's not separately criminalized. Sorry, just for the record. Great.
Oh, yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, maybe nodding doesn't really.
Great.
Do it, so.
Now, another thing I want to mention, just to clarify, if you don't feel you have the expertise to answer, no, you don't have to. So we ask a broad range of questions, and whoever wants to chip in can chip in, but you don't have all to answer to each question. So one general response is more than enough. So if anyone wants to add anything, I think Josine's response was quite clear, but if you want to add anything, please feel free to do so. Either just interrupt me or raise your hands. Otherwise, we'll move to the next question, which is, what tax crimes are most frequently perpetrated in your jurisdiction according to your experience? If you can give us a list in order of priority. And that's based on your experience, so we don't want statistics. It's about what's your feeling about it.
I think, this is Martin Lambrechts. I think one of the most frequent is filing for your VAT return, knowing that it's incorrect, and that falls under the articles that Josine already mentioned. And by that way, using the tax authorities as sort of a bank, because you get your VAT and then you have some cash money. And those crimes, those cases, they come in very small they are very small, but they come in great volumes. So they form a big part of the tax crimes that I see in my experience, and they're usually relatively easy cases. I think those are the ones I see the most.
Great answer. Josine, any other perceptions on this?
Yeah, and I saw that, but I will leave the floor to Pascal quickly as well, because I know he has a lot of experience, and I already saw him reaching for the microphone. Just very, very short, in addition to what Martin said, yeah, I've seen a lot of those, like the intentional false returns, tax returns. Something that I've also seen quite often is, but is a bit of a different goal, I think, is when an agent or it's like someone who does the tax returns for other people intentionally declared posts that weren't applicable to those people. For example, I said with special like health benefits, basically to get as much clients as possible. So that was his goal, to get more clients. And very often these people, well, they just heard from this person, you can have like 300-400 euros extra, and they were happy with it and didn't ask any questions. So I've seen several of those cases as well.
Interesting, because that connects also to the issue of enablers, which we'll see later on. Fabulous, Josine. Thank you. Pascal, do you want to add something?
Yeah, but not quite sure whether or not I will be adding really new stuff. In the Netherlands, we see a lot of income tax returns, and a lot of people tend to include something in there that's not completely true. So if you look at the vast bulk of fraud, you will find it over there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that's been done there in a fraudulent intent end up in criminal investigations. So there's this difference. If you move away from general fraud and you go to the area where criminal investigations are committed, you will find that you will have to get above a certain threshold, an amount of money that has to be stolen in the tax return before we actually come into action. And this is, I mean, the fiscal investigation services in the Netherlands. And then you see that there are more cases where corporate income tax returns are filed with wrong data. And you can see in various time frames, various fraud types. At some point, we had a lot of corporate income tax returns that were filed on the basis that real estate or other assets of a company that should have been reused were sold. Then there is this amount of money that stays with the company. The company is then sold, and then the next company has to use that money to reinvest. In fact, it doesn't, and then the money that's still there in cash gets stolen out of the company. It's a kind of fraud that you see when tax law change comes in. From corporate income tax returns, you will then typically move away to the VAT fraud, because that's one of the biggest fraud schemes that we see at this moment, at least that I see at this moment.
Pascal, you mentioned a threshold. Is there one single threshold, or how does the system of threshold work?
I'm not an expert anymore in that area because that's legislation changed. It was a multiple reasons, multiple items that you have to check. It is above 60,000 euros. It must include, if it includes an accountant that was aiding and abetting, then the case gets higher priority. So there are various items that you can check, and if the combined items that you score brings you high up to the scorecards, then more likely that specific case will be investigated.
Fabulous. Yeah. Thank you very much.
The threshold is 125,000 euros, and that's if you get above that, that's a very strong indication that the tax authorities have to file the case with us, with the Public Prosecution Service, to see whether or not we will take that case up for criminal law. And if it falls below that amount, factors come into play, like Pascal mentioned. Is there an enabler involved? Are there any other crimes committed? Then even though the financial aspect is below 125,000 euros, even then it can be accepted for criminal law. Otherwise, we let the tax authorities impose a fine themselves.
Okay, that's fantastic. So basically, this is the basis to start the investigations, but then it's not necessarily going to the prosecutor. They could still take another route, the administrative route.
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on. What are the most frequently committed transnational crimes in your jurisdiction? So what transnational tax crimes are the most frequently affecting your jurisdiction?
I think one where it involves income tax returns is that people don't include assets that they have abroad. And then in Europe, I usually see Switzerland, Cyprus, Malta, Belgium as well, neighboring countries. Yeah. Liechtenstein. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you. Other point, I think you mentioned that. So this is related. So what foreign countries are most frequently involved in transnational tax crimes that are connected to your jurisdiction? So it seems to me that these are Liechtenstein, Switzerland, and so on and so forth, right? Or do you think there are other countries that participate into these transnational schemes?
I think it depends on the type of crime. Like if it's, you could see like Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Switzerland, when they had like the secrecy of bank. I don't know if this is the English translation to the national expression, the Dutch expression. But I mean, I've had cases where people literally put suitcases full of money in the back of their trunk. Well, that was the allegation. I don't know if the case is all the way to the Supreme Court yet. And drove to Luxembourg to deposit there. But if you look at like VAT carousel fraud, we very often see Germany, UK, Spain, France, Belgium. If you see cases like undervaluation, so more custom-related tax evasion or tax fraud, you very often see more the ports. So Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg. I think those kind of countries. And sometimes if you really look into organized crime, like the organization behind the whole VAT carousel scheme, you can see even like countries that are, I don't know, on other continents.
That is a fantastic answer. Thank you. That's exactly the kind of question we wanted to ask you. Great. So final point, what are the most relevant tax crimes in terms of overall amount of tax evaded in your jurisdiction? So what are the tax crimes that are most impactful financially?
From what I see, I think VAT carousel fraud would be one of the biggest ones, but then also you have dividend withholding tax schemes that are looked in at this moment that are also, there are substantial amounts of money in there.
Yes, and those dividend stripping schemes, they are at some points very similar to VAT carousel fraud, I think.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Good.
And another
At this
thing,
point,
Lorenzo,
yep.
I can add is that we also see e-commerce, what we call e-commerce fraud, whereby traders from mainly China trade goods via Amazon, for example, without paying VAT. So they import the goods to Europe and sell them without paying VAT, and by that also making it very hard for their competitors in Europe, within Europe, to compete with them. And I think there is a lot of money involved in that as well.
It's very interesting, and someone else in a previous workshop mentioned actually exactly this kind of scheme. So it's interesting that it must be a really common transnational issue. Fantastic. So if there are no additional points, I would like to give the words to the project experts for any further considerations or specification or clarification they might want to bring to the table. So Joe, Paul, and Bran, if you have anything to add, or Stephen, any of you.
The only thing I've been following up on is a little bit with respect to agricultural subsidies, at least in terms of some research that's being done. We don't have any hard numbers on it. It goes down to some greenwashing as well, but this is a venue that's being developed in terms of whether the tax office has followed up on these type of frauds. I know at least cross-border there have been some, but statistically we don't have the amounts.
That's great, fantastic. So I think if there's no other point, we can move on. Thanks, Joe. Now, the second question is about the complexity of the legal system.
Can I interrupt, please?
Sure, you can.
Sorry, you just moved a bit quick and I still have to get a picture in my head. The comment before was with respect to, well, agricultural issues. We know that there is a lot of trade going on with a lot of money involved in there with goods that are, well, the intellectual ownership of the seeds that were stolen because it's fake. It's not built under the original product ownership, and those products end up in the Netherlands, other places in Europe as well. Proceeds of those goods will not be incorporated in income tax returns regularly because people do not like to do that. So then you have the tax problem as well. But it's also the when you import goods into the EU, you have to pay taxes on that as well, and that's the thing that they also are evading. There's two things that I've seen in my work as well.
Most interesting is this one very complex form of evasion that evades a lot of taxes here. Well done. That's very interesting. Thank you. Okay, the second question is the complexity of the legal system. So what we want to assess here is how easy it is to understand the system for a citizen in general, and how can the complexity of the tax system, and perhaps even on some legal definition of crime-related issues, can perhaps inadvertently facilitate tax offenders. So the first question is, in general, how would you assess the overall complexity of the tax system in your jurisdiction? Can this complexity unintendedly facilitate tax evasion or hamper anti-tax evasion strategies? And if so, how? And it would be greatly appreciated if you have practical examples or cases.
I think it's complex.
There you go, Martin.
I think it is complex, very complex, and I think that can get in the way sometimes of effectively prosecuting tax crimes by the fact that people can claim, well, it is so complex, our tax system, I hired this advisor, tax advisor, and he or she gave me advice and I trusted that advice. And when you have a debate in court about a tax crime, the defense can say to the criminal judge, well, this is so technical and it relates so much to the explanation and so forth of tax laws that we shouldn't have this debate in front of you, in front of the criminal judge, but in front of in a tax court. So that's the first thought that comes to my mind.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Josine.
Yeah, I smiled a bit at the start because the phrase of the National Tax Authority is, we cannot make it more fun, but we can make it easier for you. That is literally their how they sort of, how do you say, brand themselves. So when you ask, like, oh, their complex system, well, they try to make it easier for us. But I think other than your regular income tax, if you're how do you say, like an ordinary person, it becomes complicated. And I can definitely underline what Martin says. I mean, I remember the cases where having these fraudulent tax returns, and I literally had to explain to criminal judges how this system worked before we could sort of dive into the actual case. So there's a lot of material for lawyers as well to create a mist. What you do see is what I think is a very good thing, is that you see more and more that if there's complex tax fraud cases in court, that the court will decide to ask judge specialized in tax to join the combination. So you have two criminal judges and one specialized in tax, or a professor who is also a judge, for example, who is specialized in that. And I think that helps a lot. I also have the experience, but this is how to live and how to deal with this complex system. One of the other things is that we ask the field where Pascal works they have really great experts. They have accountants. We have accountants working for us in the serious fraud office. And we ask them, especially the accountants from the field, to really write reports to explain certain things that we see. Like one of the really simple things is, in the Netherlands, if you do your income tax return, they fill in everything for you. And you log into the website with your special ID, and you have to check whether everything is okay or not. It's still your responsibility, but it's not like the paper, the big book that you used to have. So if you go to court, you will have the prints from this digital system from the tax authority, which is quite difficult to read because it's all this sort of coding with sort of the abbreviations of the sentences and the lines filled in. So we have people actually giving an explanation how you should read this, things like that, to really try to make it sort of bearable, I guess.
Interesting. The simplification for the citizen becomes an issue for the criminal court. Very interesting. Next step, unless someone else wants to step in here, let's stick to the complexity, but not any longer of the tax system in itself, but rather to the criminal law system related to tax crimes. So take into account any sort of issue, formal issue, so how many different laws there are on this, or whether the law is fragmentary, rather than structural issues, how many crimes are they organized, what are the burdens of evidence, and even substantial issues. So how are the crimes defined? Are these definitions effective? Do they help prosecution or not? So how is the criminal law of tax crimes in the Netherlands?
I would say that is not very complex because Josien was also able to explain that in 1 or 2 minutes. We only have a handful of articles, and the main one is, and that makes a thing a tax crime is filing a tax return knowing that it's incorrect. So that's basically it. But when it comes to explaining what is incorrect, it becomes more difficult because then you have to take a look at the tax laws.
Okay, I think someone mentioned before that the offenses are few, but you can still use more general offenses. Do you think this is a good practice, or would you prefer, as prosecutors or as practitioners in the area anyway, would you prefer to see more special offenses dedicated to tax evasion?
My first thought is I've never missed it. I always got convictions, so no, maybe not always, but I agree with Martin. I mean, if someone falsifies documents, why would you have like a specific falsification article in the tax law? Why not just use the criminal law? So for me, my first thought would be no. I think it's actually the articles are sufficient. We can find it. We can use them, and it's more the what is being done, like the actions. For example, like vet carousel, I've had a very big investigation with Pascal, and I don't know how many times they had to explain to me what was going on. And with the vet carousels, it's quite abstract. So for me, for example, maybe I'm really stupid, I don't know, but I really need to sort of go through the whole process again. Like, oh yeah, it was that step, that. Okay, now I get it again. So you really have to think, and I know in this case we really thought, like, how are we going to present that in court as well? Can we visualize this in a way? Can we make a report? Well, I said before to make it more clear. So I think for me that the complicated part is more the action, and then the other thing is how to prove intent. But this is in many different, like, criminal offenses, like how are you going to prove that someone's intention was not proper? That's sometimes easier said than done, I think.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. This covers a lot of the next questions, so we can be satisfied with these, unless Pascal wants to add anything before we move to the...
No, I can agree to the other two. It's criminal law is more than sufficient to attack the offenses. It's the difficulty lies within tax law, getting the thing that's been done wrong, get that clear. That's the most difficult part. And then proof what is wrong in court is not an issue anymore. But the other issue is all the tools that lawyers have to, well, make cases stretch out for a longer period of time, and then you pass the normal period that you have to get somebody convicted, and then sentences are diminished, and all those things, they actually hamper, well, getting a good conviction. But that's not the law itself.
Yeah, so these are more general problems that affect the criminal justice system as such, rather than... Great. Final question on this set. How do you think the overall anti-tax evasion legal framework contribute to the investigations in your jurisdiction? Is that a framework that supports your work, or is that something that could be improved?
If I look at, sorry, Yassine, go ahead.
No, go, Pascal, go.
Okay, thanks. If I look at the tools that we have in the Netherlands, it's mostly pretty good. When we attack tax evasion from the Netherlands, then it's not that big of a problem. When you take into account the evidence that you need to obtain to prove that, you have to go to other jurisdictions, and then you work with the AMLET procedures, legal aid requests, and things like that, and then you find yourself getting answers to questions in about 2 years later. That is something that's hampering the system, but that is working together with transnational investigation.
Yeah,
I think that's the bigger problem.
We have EPO now, so maybe at least on European turf, it will be. I'm very idealistic. Maybe I should have said that. No, but you see organizations like Olaf and EPO really trying to get hold of these, how you say, like, advantages that criminals have when they go cross border. And this, I think, this is a very something that at least for some of the tax offenses, of course, this is part of the whole scheme, is that you go to other countries when you pretend to pay taxes in one country and you don't pay them in etc. So with the whole vet carousel, I think, to be honest, if I look at the tax law, I mean, I'm not that specialized in it, fortunately, and I like criminal law a lot better. Of course, I hope it wasn't designed for criminal offenses. I think it was designed for people to be able to get them to pay taxes for other causes. And I think for now, you see sometimes with new technical developments that new types of crimes or VAT carousels pop up. I mean, e-commerce was already mentioned. Deliveries of parcels via Amazon, and like 20 years ago, of course, we didn't have that. But you also really see that both member states and European organizations try to respond to that rather quickly. But of course, it's always a response, because if a criminal act doesn't occur, if there's no new trend in criminal offenses, we're not going to change anything. So you're always running after the facts, which can be sometimes frustrating as well.
Good point. So the problem of the reactive system rather than proactive, the difficulty to make the system proactive. Great. So we concluded this set of questions. So again, the floor goes to the project experts, Joe, Paul, Stephen, Bran. If any of you has any further points or questions, feel free to intervene.
Yeah, hello. I'm just thinking in a matter of brainstorming and following the discussions. Thank you so much for very important points. I'm thinking about the complexity of legislation, regulation of tax fraud, and what are the views of experts, or just as a general point, I'm raising this when it comes to certain substantive fragmentation of laws, where, for example, in the UK, what we see is that we often use anti-money laundering tools and mechanisms to be policing other types of crimes, so including tax evasion. So where it is adds some complexity, or how this substantive concurrence or concurrence of existing laws that tackle economic crimes such as tax evasion, operate in the Netherlands. And secondly, we kind of frame the discussion as a dichotomy between criminal law and tax laws. So I'm as well interested in kind of like use of private mechanisms which have a quasi-criminal powers or effects, as opposed to kind of like traditional criminal law. So again, in the UK, a number of regulators going kind of civil recovery pathway rather than pursuing more criminal law pathway. So I would be grateful for your views on that. Thank you.
Any answer on these points, sort of the impact of the fragmentation of the law and the impact on the dichotomy between criminal law and tax law? So I think what in continental Europe we call the administrative apparatus.
I'm thinking, if I understand the question, or if I'm now gonna give a ridiculous answer, just interrupt me then, and before I make an absolute fool of myself. I think it's actually several questions in one. First of all, I think there's in the Netherlands, I feel like I never really had a problem with it, is that you have quite a clear distinction until when the tax authority investigates themselves and gives a fine, for example. I mean, they can give a fine, so it's a penalty, or they can ask for money back, and it's regulated quite clearly what they do, when they can do it, and what we can still do in criminal investigations after they have done certain things. So, for example, almost all of their investigative material is admissible in court in a criminal investigation, as long as it's not dependent on the will of the suspect. So this means that almost all the investigation that the tax authority conducts, we can use unless it's the interview of the suspect. It also means, on the other hand, that if, I mean, I've had those cases, if the tax authority has fined the suspect already and it can be something super simple, that we sometimes cannot prosecute anymore, because otherwise it would be ne bis in idem. So we would they would be penalized twice. But if they've only been asked to give the money back, but no penalty, then we can prosecute. I don't know if this was sort of what you meant with your question, or if this is like a totally random answer now.
Bran, what do you think? It satisfies you?
Yeah, thank you very much for this reflection.
Marvelous. Thank you all. So ready to move on to the final set of questions for the first part. We're quite in time. So this final set for the first part concerns the relationship between the different actions in the fight against tax crimes or tax evasion. So prevention, investigation, enforcement and sanctions, and then recoveries and remedies. So we're trying to explore the relationship between these different stages. So the first question is about prevention. So apart from criminal law, is there some sort of duty, legal duty, or perhaps a policy or a strategy for public institutions to adopt preventive measures that are not restrictive? So not confiscation or any other kind of order, but rather, education, training, awareness raising, information campaigns, simplification of certain systems. So do you think in the Netherlands, the authorities feel this obligation to prevent with softer means before resorting to criminal law?
What comes to my mind when you ask this is the whole KYC, know your customer, that flows from the anti-money laundering regulation. And we see all sorts of gatekeepers that are being stressed, to really pursue those measures and implement them and raise awareness that you have to know who you are dealing with. And well, that concerns banks, tax advisors, and those sorts of agents and potential facilitators. So I think that has developed quite a lot in the recent years.
Fabulous. But this is something that is still a sort of obligation for the privates rather than an obligation for the authorities to prevent, right? So
Yeah,
are there
yeah,
education campaigns or information campaigns or special training programs, anything? In another workshop, just to give you an example, someone has cited commercial made by the government that says tax evasion is bad. We want to create a culture that,
Well, we have some. Sorry, go ahead, Martin.
No, go ahead, Pascal.
We have had some campaign by the Dutch government, and that was a longer period of time ago. And then we had this whole issue with KB Lux. There was a bank in Luxembourg that had a bank account of Dutch saving money that wasn't declared to the income tax returns. And there was a campaign in that time, and they measured the effect of it by looking at the voluntarily, how you say that, inkeerregeling. Martin, can you help me out there?
Yeah, there was a long period of time that you could declare assets abroad that you hadn't declared yet without getting a fine or a full fine. And by that way, the government tried to, how do you say that, stimulate people to declare.
Go straight.
Yeah. Actually, this ties very well with the next question, which is precisely this. So the procedures of leniency or favorable treatment for tax evaders that perhaps declare the wrong statements or they correct their mistakes. Now, the question is, can you discuss whether these sort of leniency or favorable treatment can actually be exploited and encourage tax evasion? So, for instance, classic examples, I can evade tax because I know that government once every few years makes an amnesty and forgives everyone. So I can do that.
I can understand where you're coming from, because that's an Italian thing. That, at least from Italy, we know that that's happened a lot of times. In the Netherlands, from what I know, and that's just my small thing that I've seen, looking at the old system where you could voluntarily, write your mistakes without getting penalties or fines and things like that. I think there were a lot of people that were saying, okay, as long as I'm not discovered, I have the option to correct my wrongs without a penalty. And it would create an atmosphere whereby people would commit more crimes. And at some point, that's what I wanted to say earlier on, the government did ads and commercials like that to get people to change that behavior. I didn't really do that much. But then at some point when there were convictions published in newspapers, that would actually make a change, because at that point, the tax authorities saw that, let's say, 50 people made a declaration, say, hey, sorry, I did something wrong in the past. I want to change that. So therefore, we don't see those ads at that much. But at some point, a couple of years ago, they changed the legislation, and now you get a penalty. When you try to correct your wrongs from the past, you actually have to pay a penalty. And then people are saying, hey, that is not the way to go, because then people that did something wrong are even more, holding back to correct their wrongs. And from what I hear, that's not the case. From what I hear, it creates more an atmosphere. Say, okay, I can do something wrong, but I'd rather not, because anyway I go, I get a penalty. So I think it helps.
Great. So it's the balance between the favorable instrument that allows to correct honest mistakes, but also the punishment when things go actually wrong. So there is an intention there. Great.
Sorry, could I add something to that? Because I think in general, it's if there's no chance of getting caught, I mean, I think my theory would be that a lot of people would avoid paying any taxes, because there's very little people realize, like, oh, what am I actually paying it for? They think like, oh, this is just less money for me. And what I do, I wanted to give one example of I thought it was very interesting. For example, we had this threshold of the 125,000 euros. So at one point, you could see there were a lot of like tax returns just below that, or there weren't actually, but the whole income was. And at one point there was a suspicion of people really sort of realizing that if they stayed under this threshold, worst case scenario, they would have to pay back only or have like an administrative fine instead of a criminal conviction. So that's when the tax authority, together with I think the field and the prosecutor's office, decided to have this project of looking into these tax returns just below these thresholds. And they had a project, and these people were convicted. It was also explained to court why, because of course the lawyers would say, but this is not what we can expect because the threshold hasn't been met. But one of the other reasons to start a criminal investigation, if you have a certain project with like similarities between several types of fraud suspicions that you want to investigate as, like, how do you say, as a project. So they were I think most of them were convicted actually. But this is so you do see that they try to look at find the limits and the loopholes, of course. Yeah,
that's very, very interesting, and that maybe should be imitated by other countries. So connected to this question is the exploitation of another possibility. Is there any possibility in the Netherlands to pay with assets that are different than money? And if so, is there any risk of criminal exploitation of that?
I don't know.
I don't think so. I don't know. Like, I
pay
don't
your
think
taxes
you can...
with something else than money.
Yeah,
like
for
a
instance,
car or your house.
Yeah,
or
I don't have any money. I want to give in my car or my jewels, whatever, and the state takes them. But perhaps there is a risk of criminal exploitation. Maybe the value is different. Maybe maybe there is money hidden somewhere, but they don't want the state to discover. Any possibility?
I
don't
think it's
think
not
that's an
possible.
option.
No,
It's not. I don't think it's possible. And if you have an outstanding tax debt and you're not paying that, but you have a house or a car or a boat, then the tax authorities at some point will be able to sell those assets and pay the debt out of the revenue out of the profits.
Yeah, they can confiscate your assets. And
Yeah.
So classic recovery. Okay, great. Now, question about investigation. So how do you feel, particularly the prosecutors, how do they feel that the suspicious activity reports filed by the tax authorities satisfy their needs during the investigation? So do they include sufficient indications for you? Do they include sufficient elements to prove the intention, for instance, which you mentioned before, is a tricky aspect? So how do you see these reports? Are they satisfactory?
Yes and no. I think, yeah. Criminal law is in some way very easy, but I think for a general tax inspector or people working at the tax authorities, they are not used to focus on criminal intention and the ways by which you can prove that or need to be able to prove that. So sometimes the reports we get, the filings we get from the tax authorities are weak on that point. But that's also the point where we come in. So that's our job. Yeah. I don't know, Yosin, what your experience is.
Yeah, it's quite similar. It's a different angle. It's a different point of reference. And I've had really good reports where yeah, basically you just had to question the suspect again, and then you could go to court. But I've also unfortunately had reports that also sometimes damaged or diminished your chances in a criminal investigation because they made the suspect a bit wiser already. Let's put it that way. So yeah, and sometimes it's something in between. So they did their job, they hand it over to you, and you finish it. Yeah, you finish your work, and you come to a conclusion that there is enough evidence or not. I think Pascal and I've had some discussions in a case where we had some the quality wasn't always.
Yeah, and Pascal, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, well, we have this new phenomenon that we are now need to go back to the smaller enterprises if they report a suspicious activity report, if they file that, and it could harm their business. It's not allowed to use it. We have to go back to ask whether or not we can use it or not. So even if the SARS report is good, the question whether or not it's admissible for a court case is well, not a certainty. And what I find that entities that need to report in bulk because they have a lot of reports, a lot of issues that could be well qualified as suspicious, that the quality then really diminishes. And when you go to a notary where they just have this one case that really astonished them, then you see that report is well meeting a perfect standard, and you could actually go to court with that. So there's no black and white answer there.
Maybe it's good to say that very often it doesn't. I think that Martin said it's a bit like very often it doesn't really hurt the criminal investigation. We just have to do our job. So for me, they did their job and their part, and as long as it's not damaging the criminal investigation, which is also difficult for them to already sort of think about when they're doing their normal control checks, to think about like, what if this will become a criminal investigation where they have no experience with investigating like in criminal cases. So this is something we should cut them some slack. I think the problem arrives when, for example, they already had a very clear suspicion, and instead of reporting it to us, they continued on their titles. Then it can become a bit complicated. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. I think we have covered almost everything we needed. I think now we can give the word to Paul, who has some slides on this particular area, and perhaps he can corroborate these points and perhaps add something new. I will have to leave for a second because I need for some reason to sign into Zoom, otherwise my time here will expire. So Paul, if you want to go ahead, if you can share the slides, and then I will log back in as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to, I think some of the research Joe and I have been doing actually touches on a lot of the points that have been raised. What we kind of look at is the role of financial institutions that are playing in financial crimes, right? So do financial intermediaries, what role do they play in facilitating or potentially policing instances of tax avoiding, sanctions evasion, money laundering, etc.? Are financial institutions enabling this? Are they simply innocent bystanders? Are they doing the bare minimum as required by regulators? Which often many regulators in the case of multinationals that touch upon many jurisdictions and are potentially complying with financial markets regulators. I think Branislav touched on this point above, the sort of alphabet soup of different regulators and where their purview often overlaps. One question we're asking are do banks, do these financial institutions as financial intermediaries simply accept these fines as the cost of doing business? Somebody mentioned the case of SARS, and we look at some of these banks literally almost every transaction they file a SAR for as a way to kind of like protect themselves and do explicitly what's required by regulators, or are the SARs they file more meaningful in helping regulators actually uncover instances of financial crime? And then we kind of go on to this other question. We asked, what about the investors in these institutions, the shareholders? Do they care about this? Do they accept it as a role of doing business, or do they accept it as a price of doing business, these fines? Can they play a role through corporate governance mechanisms in encouraging banks, financial intermediaries to actually take enforcement and prevention a little more seriously? So we do this event study methodology. This is not quite a formal way to present it, but the impact is, the illustration is a little bit better. So this is just showing a snapshot of the share prices of ING and ABN AMRO around the time of the FinCEN leaks last year. There was a little bit of market expectation. We can see a couple of days before the share price starts to decrease, also released in US time and then over on a Friday. And so a little bit time over the weekend sharing, and a precipitous drop in the market value of these banks. In the medium term, so here it looks like within a month, shares already bouncing back. Might seem that banks have kind of, investors in banks have absorbed this information and don't care too much about it in the long term. But what are the short-term implications of that? And so in addition to the FinCEN leaks, we look at also the imposition of various financial related fines against financial service companies in the US. And then we, obviously I should mention, we control for things like the size of the institution, profitability, some of these other factors. So we are considering that in our analysis. And what we generally find is, even though the market reactions to these fines may seem short-lived, giving perhaps the perception that this is kind of accepted as a cost of doing business, after 10, 15 days, we see that share values have returned. What we do see is that firms with better corporate governance characteristics end up being levied with fewer fines. And again, this is controlling for other firm level variables. And then we also see that within these reaction times, firms with better corporate governance, there's less leakage before the event, before a fine is levied, and the duration of the market reaction is lessened. So perhaps indicating that companies are willing to take these fines seriously and actually change internally, or perhaps they have a better cooperation with regulators and a history of rectifying these problems, and so markets end up reacting a little bit better to this. So what we kind of propose here is this potential additional route as institutional investors, large shareholders, potentially playing a role in additionally putting some pressure on large banks and financial institutions in monitoring and policing some of their activities. Joe, did you want to add anything to this?
The only thing I can add is that we haven't looked at smaller companies, private companies in this. So this is only public large corporations. But we know the Netherlands, at least the data we've looked at from the amount of SARS issued is, and we're looking at both US and Netherlands, is that their numbers decrease substantially. Lots of criticism. So what we're trying to do is take out the noise and look at the effect of a private instrument, institutional investor monitoring on the cost of tax evasion, or in this case, tax fraud, and whether the cost of capital, that is the shareholders, what they value most, is affecting those corporations, those banks and others who undertake these activities. The trade-off between fines on the one hand and long-term shareholder interests is ultimately what we're going to try to get to see, can governance be another way to tackle tax evasion? And that's, I think, the end of the paper.
Splendid, Joe. Thank you, Paul. This is a very interesting point that actually helps us introducing the final point that we need to mention in this first part, which is vulnerability. So I would kindly ask you to identify what are the most vulnerable sectors to tax crimes and in general corruption practices, and then Costa will take you to corruption in the second part of the session in particular sectors. So for instance, construction, infrastructures, communication, media, education, energy, farming, financial sector, health, hospitality, manufacture, technology, retail, really anything. So what are the most vulnerable sectors? Please name the three that you think are the most vulnerable, the first three.
Well, Josie, yeah.
Of course,
You want to pick first?
Yeah, I will go first. The first I'm thinking about is construction, but maybe it's because we had a very big case in construction that it's sort of, I think, changed the fraud landscape and how fraud was perceived by also the whole public. It was a very big case, and there were big penalties for the perpetrators, and it made massive headlines. And since then, it was also in the middle of the economic crisis when the court session took place. And I really think people started to realize, like, I am actually a victim of this, of tax fraud and corruption, because in the end, it's costing us money, even if it's indirectly. So this is, and also, I mean, I've done several corruption investigations, and yeah, it's as soon as you go abroad, and especially to like Africa, Middle East, where construction companies tend to go, corruption is well, I don't know if it's more common, but I've seen it in several investigations. Another one that I think is maybe not something we see very often in criminal investigation, but I think everyone knows, is hospitality. I think there's a big black market in hospitality. I think a lot of employees are paid without a contract, or just what we call a 0-hour contract. So the half of their salary is usually well, you don't see it ending up at the tax authority on their returns. I do know that we had a very big case also with in a big franchise of certain popular food chain in the Netherlands. So that's another one that I would mention. And the third for me is also an interesting one, I think, is the technical e-commerce was already mentioned. But I know, like, if you have new technical developments, you have more opportunities for example, vet carousel, especially if it's when they could shift from big materialistic items to smaller, and from smaller to things you cannot trace because it's services, for example. So I think the technological sector is vulnerable for it because they go much faster than we do.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Any other top three from either of you? Martin.
I would say also construction infrastructure sector, in the sense that it includes real estate. And I think, Josien, you are referring to the Klimop vastgoedfraudezaak. Yes. Yeah. I still see a lot of people working in real estate that have a suspect status in the cases I'm handling right now and have handled before. Secondly, I would say the financial sector, and I would refer. Oh, it's blurred. I would like to refer to a book, Banking on Failure, by Richard Collier. He works at University of Oxford, and I think if you take tax crimes and tax evasion, etc., seriously, I think it's a very important book, and he explains why banks and the financial sector play a very central role in tax evasion, tax crime. And I recognize things he describes. And as a third, I would say e-commerce, and I explained that before in this session.
Thank you, Martin. Marvelous. Okay, there are no other comments. We need to rush on towards the final element of this set, which is what are the vulnerabilities then? So some of you mentioned them already. If you have any other examples of cases in which particular tax avoidance or tax evasion scheme exploit these vulnerabilities, please do let us know. You mentioned already e-commerce. You mentioned, Josine was very detailed about this. Any other ideas? Great. Then let's give the floor to the project experts if they have any observation on sectors that are vulnerable and specific vulnerabilities. No one? Great. So this session is over. We have now 5 minutes break. So we will see each other back at 3:18. And we'll start with the second section led by Costa. And thank you everyone so much, because this has been really phenomenal. Thank you all. I see you here back in 5 minutes. See you later.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I will pause the recording now.